Welcome friends to the online course on Health, Safety and Environmental Management in Offshore and Petroleum Engineering. We are discussing lectures on module 1 where we are focusing on environmental management issues related to production from offshore and oil industries. In this lecture, which is the 5th lecture in module 1, we are going to talk about ecological monitoring. We already said in the last lecture that environmental protection is implementable only when the management schemes or the rules and regulations are framed by including the stakeholders as the members. It also depends upon various factors which we discussed in the last lecture, out of which socio-economic perspective is one important and major concern which governs the management laws, rules and regulations which are intended to save the environment, especially the marine environment, because the contaminants or the pollutions caused by the oil spills, the drilling discharges, etc., as we have seen in the previous lectures, are precarious and they are really very alarming. If we talk about environmental management and let us say we lead towards establishing or framing standards and requirements, let us say we are interested to frame standards and requirements then what should we actually consider when we start framing such standards and requirements or when we are revising such standards and requirements? The standards which are essentially important to implement the environmental protection govern implementation of the management policies, which should include the following factors. The first factor which we must consider should be, most importantly, the content of mercury and cadmium which are very harmful for the marine species, which are present usually in the barite base of drilling fluid, should be restricted, should be kept as minimum as possible. The second point, I will come to the number later. The second point is that no discharge of drilling waste is permitted in waters within 3 miles from the shore. So, no discharge of drilling fluid is permitted within 3 miles from the shore. At any cost, no discharge of diesel is allowed at any cost, no discharge of free oil is allowed. This can be checked using a specific test called static sheen test. Is used to check the discharge of free oil sleek on the surface. This test should conform to LC50 values. This test should conform to lethal concentration 50, we already given the figure in the last lecture, which should be arrived based on mycet toxicity test. Now, the average concentration in oil, that is the average oil concentration when it is discharged should not be more than 7 milligram per liter on a monthly basis or 13 milligram per liter on a daily oil concentration. Now, the question comes, when an oil leak or oil concentration is found on surface waters, you need to measure them, because you need to measure them, take a sample, do the test in the lab to find the toxicity. Also, you have to take a sample and do the static sheen test to really check whether the oil concentration is within the permissible limits on a monthly basis or on a daily basis. Now, where will you collect this sample? Obviously, when you collect such samples very near to the source of discharge, the concentration is likely to be higher. When you collect this sample far away from the point of discharge, obviously they will be lower. So, you have got to also specify where you have got to collect this sample. So, the discharge should be measured within 4 miles from the shore. To check whether it is toxic or non-toxic, or to check whether they are within the standards prescribed by the rules and regulations of the local agency or not. So, all these come under a single frame of discussion, what we call ecological monitoring. Now, ecological monitoring is an activity or a basic method which is used to control and manage activities related to marine pollution. Ecological monitoring is actually a system which collects information about the changes in the natural parameters that occurred due to oil pollution in an open sea. So, actually it is an indirect method to measure the marine pollution. One may ask me a question, why it is an indirect method? We are not interested in measuring the concentration of discharge, volume of discharge, etc. Then what are we measuring? We are measuring the consequences that arise from the discharge on the sea life. Now, one may ask me a question, why are we interested in measuring an indirect way of consequences and then checking whether the pollution is within the standard limits? The basic reason is pollution arising from oil cannot be measured directly because of its complex composition. So, oil pollution cannot be measured directly because of its complex That is one reason. The second reason is availability in different forms. Physical, chemical and biological forms. Therefore, we always measure the consequences on the marine organisms which is caused by the oil pollution, and we try to check whether they are within the permissible limits. That is why you can see very clearly here, to measure the consequence we always talk about the lethal concentration, and we are not talking about the turbidity or the content in terms of its concentration, though we say the limits are so and so, which can be also measured directly, but this alone will not help us to really know whether environmental protection is enabled. So, we are always interested, or in terms, ecological monitoring is always a method which collects information about the changes in the natural parameters of the marine organisms which occurred due to oil pollution. So, it is actually indirect method of monitoring. You can also monitor this using a biological manner. The biological monitoring is based on a technique which measures the molecular and cellular effects under low levels of impact which cannot be measured by chemical analysis, because the levels of impact are so low, the chemical analysis cannot capture them. Can always see here again, biological monitoring is also a technique which is indirectly measuring the molecular and cellular effects on the marine organisms. Therefore, friends, ecological monitoring in offshore production is done at the local level. You cannot do this at global level, because the concentration is more local, then regional, and then if it is very severe, it can get globalized, which we already seen in the previous lectures. Now, ecological monitoring is done in different stages. The first stage, you have to identify the possible potential hazards. Which can arise from the impact sources. So, possible potential hazards are identified in the first stage. In the second stage, you make regular observations at periodic intervals on the marine biota. So, it is an indirect way to qualitatively assess the responses of biological organisms under the impact of oil pollution. So, we are measuring the biological, the qualitative assessment on the biological organisms, how do they behave, how the functionality is affected, how the reproduction is retarded or increased, etc. So, you are measuring the consequences, you are having a qualitative assessment, that is the second stage in ecological monitoring. So, based on this you develop what is called cause effect relationship is established or developed between the documented biological effects on the species and the impact factor. The total impact in environment and the biota, including the impact on the commercial species and biological resources, are assessed at this stage. Finally, in the third stage, we suggest corrective measures for checking the marine pollution. We can also recommend certain preventive measures if necessary, so that the marine pollution can be kept under control within permissible limits accepted globally, regionally and then locally. Let us slightly move on the discussions on environmental pollution or environmental management from offshore to onshore. We already know once the oil or hydrocarbon is identified, it is produced or drilled from a specific source as a crude oil, it will be transported to shore for processing. However, these days processing is also done on the offshore platform itself, so that you can save the cost of transporting a crude oil, which after processing gives about 60 to 65% waste. So, people are not interested in transporting the crude oil from the platform to the onshore for processing. They would rather like to process the commercial product in the platform itself and only transport the pure commercial product for sale directly, so that the discharges or the effluent waste which are actually exit from this kind of processing plants can be discharged back in sea waters. So, there is another precarious movement which an offshore engineer or an environmentalist should seriously focus at. If the processing does happen in the offshore platforms itself, now the discharges which are coming from the oil by accident will now become intentional, because these all will be discharges from the processing plants. However, in the present scenario, these discharges do come to the sea, there is no doubt on that, but they do not come from the offshore platforms, but they do come from the onshore processing refineries. So, we include them in this case as well. Now, most important aspect here in terms of onshore activities, where we talk about processing industries which do refinery for converting the crude oil into commercially available trade species, the most important concern generally comes to atmospheric pollution. Atmospheric pollution essentially caused only by the refinery industries which are associated closely with an oil and gas production scenario. So, to understand atmospheric pollution, we have in the literature two exclusively specific models which are called release models and dispersion models. The release model identifies the type of release of the material, this model is essentially used to assess the release rate of the toxic material into atmosphere. It of course includes estimation of downwind concentration of the released material. Alternatively, the other model is also used to capture or understand atmospheric pollution, that is called dispersion model. As the name suggests very clearly, this describes the dispersion of vapor in the downwind direction. Now, there are three different kinds of vapor cloud behavior, and one can relate the corresponding time release models in the given literature. The vapor cloud behavior has three essential features. One, it could be a neutrally buoyant gas, it can be a positively buoyant gas, it can be a dense buoyant gas which can form a cloud. The release model which is suggested to mathematically model this is, for example, in neutrally buoyant gas people use instantaneous model. Which is called as puff model. To capture the vapor cloud behavior which arise from positively buoyant gas, one can use continuous model which is called plume model in the literature. If you want to model the vapor cloud behavior that arise from the dense buoyant gas, one can use a continuous time varying model. So, these are the three ways by which the vapor cloud behavior which arises from different types of gas can be captured in terms of dispersion release models. Please look at the screen. You have a picture which shows you the continuous release model which is a plume model. If you look at the screen here, let us say this is a source which is releasing continuously the atmospheric pollutant which comes in the atmosphere. We already said that if it is a positively buoyant gas, one can go for a plume model which has to capture the dispersion on the downwind side using a continuous release. So, this picture very clearly shows this is my downwind area. So, the dispersion is continuous. So, my model is supposed to capture the continuous variation of concentration of the pollution in air which arises essentially from the source which is called continuous release source. The next could be an instantaneous release source. Let us say the source released instantaneously. Please look at the screen here now. For any instantaneous released source in the downwind side, if you want to really capture the vapor cloud behavior, one can go for a puff model which is instantaneous release model. So, one can see here the concentration is instantaneous but not continuous, unlike you saw in the plume model. Now, let us look at the factors which affects dispersion. Foremost could be the wind speed. Depending upon the wind speed, the spread distance and the intensity and the area of spread will also be governed. So, essentially wind speed is one of the important characteristic which should be considered in the model. The second could be the terrain effects. If the terrain is rough and vegetative, it will have a different effect on the dispersion conversely with that of an open terrain. The third could be atmospheric stability. What do you understand by atmospheric stability? Atmospheric stability related to the temperature, weather conditions, humidity, of course, the wind velocity and weather climate, etc. So, atmospheric stability. The fourth could be the height of release of the gas above the ground. And lastly and very importantly, the initial momentum of release. So, these are the factors which affects the model that accounts for dispersion in the downwind side. Amongst this, let us talk about the first effect, which is the wind speed. The dispersed gas will initially get diluted with the passage of air. So, let us look at the process, physical process. The dispersed gas or the cloud, the vapor cloud will get diluted with the passage of air. Now, the emitted gas which is released will now travel forward it will also travel faster because of the wind speed. So, forward plus faster. So, while it travels forward and faster, it further gets diluted because large quantity of air is added during the travel. So, the foremost issue here is one would like to know what is the wind speed at any specific location. So, what is the wind speed or wind velocity at any specific location? One would also like to know what is the dominant wind direction which is predominantly present in that geographic location. One would also like to know what would be the percentage of contribution of wind speed versus direction at any given location of our choice. What does it mean is, does the wind flow at that location circumferentially 360 degrees, or is it predominantly at any specific direction? If at all so, what is the percentage of contribution of wind speed in that specific direction? So, on the other hand, you can always locate very easily the predominant downwind direction. If you are able to locate the predominant downwind direction in a specific geographic location of your processing plant, you can always design your dispersion system in such a manner that the dispersed gas or the emitted gas can get diluted in much faster rate. Therefore, the pollution concentration can be diluted or reduced. So, where do you get this data from? We can get this data from what is called as a Windrose diagram. Windrose diagram actually are plotted for specific regions. I can even say specific locations of interest. This should show wind speed, wind direction, and relative frequency at which the wind is blowing. Why I say relative? Because compared to all directions circumferentially at that particular point, what is the relative frequency at which the wind is blowing in a specific dominant direction? One should like to know this. Then only you can design the dispersion system in such a manner that if at all the emitted gas is dispersed by accident, it can get diluted much faster, because the wind speed and the wind velocity and the direction is designed in such a manner that a system can get diluted much faster. So, Windrose diagram comprises of actually 16 angular wedges. So, obviously 360 by 16, each wedge will be 22.5 degrees, equally divided. It contains color segments. Each segment represent a specific wind speed when blowing from a specific direction. The radius of the wedges in the Windrose diagram represent the percentage of time wind came from the direction at any specific location. So, please look at the screen. You can see a typical Windrose diagram which has been taken as a data on June 20th, 2011 at about 3:10 in the afternoon. You can very well see here, please look at the board here. So, north, east, south, west. So, each is divided into 3 parts. So, 1, 2, 3, 4 quarter. So, 16 wedges, 4 quarters. So, 16 wedges, each about 22.5 degrees. So, I want to name this specific case. Now, I can say this is north, this is west. Therefore, this can be northwest. So, I want to name this. This is more towards north. So, I should say northwest, because that is the quadrant towards north. I should have to name this. So, it is again in the northwest quadrant, but towards west. Obviously, if you want to name, let us say this is going to be northeast, this is more towards north. So, north northeast, this is more towards east. So, east northeast. Similarly, you can also name the remaining parts in the same fashion as we can understand. So, Windrow's diagram has got 16 segments, each one of them equally divided by 22.5 degrees. If you look at the screen back now, where a Windrow's diagram is projected on the screen, you can see here the Windrow's diagram seen on the screen now has got different color index, which shows the various wind speed, that is red color shows more than 10 meter per second recorded at that particular interval, and the other colors are shown, whereas the mean speed at that physical location calculated as 2.59 meter per second, the peak direction is north northwest. Why? Because the red is the maximum wind speed and the red is seen predominantly in north northwest. There are no reds otherwise seen anywhere. Therefore, the predominant wind direction or the peak direction for this specific location is north northwest. Similarly, the percentage calm or the calm wind speed is considered to be 0.5 meter per second for a specific location, and if you look at the frequencies in terms of percentage, let us say I want to know this particular value projected on the y axis, which is about, let us say, 18. So, we say that the peak frequency, which is on the predominant direction of north northwest, is about 18.64 percentage. So, it means in this location predominantly wind blew or wind came from north northwest direction at a velocity of 10 meter per second, and in a given percentage specific location in the period of interest, this was about 18%. So, Windrow's diagram helps you to understand the wind speed, the wind predominant direction, and of course, the relative frequency of that particular wind speed of your choice at a specific geographic location at a specific time of interest, because you want to know what is the variation during the day. So, you cannot plot a variation entirely on a single scale. You can take any period of interest, keep on plotting intermittently, then you can take a mean value of a variation of wind speed and of course, the variation of wind direction as well. So, Windrow's diagram is a very useful graphical tool which helps you to actually find out the qualitative and quantitative information about the wind speed, the wind direction and the relative frequency with which the wind is blowing in a specific geographic location at any specific time of interest. Now, the wind speed and the direction of wind speed are influenced by the release which is happening, and this influence is very significant. Now, we would like to know what is that wind speed which can be computed analytically. So, for a stable air condition and a near neutral condition, wind speed is given by uz is equal to u10 of z by 10, where to the power p, where p is called power coefficient. This value is taken as 0.4, 0.28 and 0.16 respectively for urban area, for suburban area and for rural areas. U10 is the wind speed at the reference height of 10 meter elevation from the ground. And Z of course is elevation plotted or taken in meters. So, obviously, if you substitute 10 here, you will see that the Z variation up to 10 will be exactly a constant value. So, how does it vary is what you can see from the screen. I will show you a different figure later. So, the second issue which is going to talk about or which is going to affect the dispersion release models is going to be the terrain effect. The terrain effect will also influence the wind dispersion models very seriously. We will talk about this in detail in the next lecture. We will also talk about the stability class and the humidity and temperature variation respect to the dispersion release models in the next lecture. So, in this lecture we try to introduce you the important issues related to the dispersion models which can be discussed and seen in the presentation in this lecture. So, we would like to request you to go through the reference literature given in NPTEL website for parallel reading, so that any doubts or any difficulties you have in understanding these lectures can be posted back to me at NPTEL website, which can be clarified subsequently. Thank you very much.